Hey there, and welcome to this week's From the Vault episode from the Magdalen House podcast. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Dallas, Texas, and known affectionately by many as Maggies. Every first and third Wednesday, we bring you a new release. In our From the Vault episodes, we share past podcast releases from our 3 different podcast series, Recover Ed, Recovered Interviews with Alcoholics, and Hope for the Family. Our podcasts aim to connect, inspire, and educate alcoholics, loved ones, and the community to the Magdalen House and the services we offer. We're so glad you're here. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to Recovered Interviews with Alcoholic Women. Today we have our guest, Bridget, joining us. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I just love her energy. It's so great. And I know that she may even sponsor some of the women on this call or has had sponsored some of the women on this call. All right, Bridget, and your first question is to just tell us about yourself, give us some background information about yourself and what led you to get sober.
Good morning. So a little bit of background and what led me to get sober is the first question. Sure. Okay. So a little bit of background when it comes to alcohol and alcoholism. The first time that I ever drank, I drank alcoholically. My very first encounter with alcohol, I drank alcoholically. My very first encounter with alcohol, I got blackout drunk, threw up, passed out, had to have my mom come pick me up, the whole shebang, go to church the next day, the whole deal. I was 17. I didn't have really previous experiences with alcohol at all. My first experience was with a bottle of Sky vodka and what I thought was a shot glass. It turns out it was a candle holder. And so when I thought I was taking a shot, I was probably taking about 3 shots. You know, that very first shot, I still remember that, 19 years later, it's that warm rush, and kind of like melted into the couch a little bit. And I thought, well, this is great. This is great. I'll have a little bit more of that. Of course I was still sitting down and that went down a few times. And before I knew it, boy, that was it. And that was my very first experience with alcohol. So, even then I didn't think, oh, that's probably enough. That's probably okay. I feel good. Let's leave it there. No, it was more. This feels good. I want more. This feels good. I want more. So that, that was enough to kind of turn me off alcohol for a little period of time. It was a pretty traumatic experience. And it, kind of playing around with alcohol in the next few years. And in my early 20s, I was drinking alcoholically. I was blacking out. I thought that was perfectly normal. Not only normal, I thought that was the point of drinking, right? The people around me weren't having these blackout episodes, and I was, and I didn't even notice that. It wasn't until, examining my drinking career in hindsight that I realized that the way that I was drinking, the way that I was treating alcohol was different, was abnormal from the people around me. Fast forward many years later, 17 years after my first drink was when I first decided or tried to get sober. The few intervening years leading up until that point is when I finally realized in myself that my drinking was a problem. People around me had noticed that my drinking was a problem. People around me had chastised me, had tried to shame me, had tried to change, my environment, different rules in the house. I tried to escape, to different geographical locations, the things that we try, right, to avoid the center problem. And it wasn't until the last couple of years where I finally, within myself, was like, okay, something's wrong here. Something's, getting out of my control here. And I need some assistance with that. I was under the impression that there was no such thing as treatment that would be affordable for me. I had even asked my mom one time, I'd said, hey, I'll sell my car. And she said, Bridget, that wouldn't cover it. So I just kind of given up on getting professional help and thought, had convinced myself that, look, I'm just having a really rough period in my life. And as soon as I get over this hump, as soon as I get to a better relationship, as soon as I get to a better job, as soon as I'm able to move somewhere else, that the drinking will be back under control. I say back under control as if it ever was, but there were periods of years in my life where, drinking wasn't my priority, right? There were, some outside issues that, took precedence, and that kind of put a damper on the drinking, so I would recall those, frequently, those periods of years, and thinking, I can't really be an alcoholic because I've gone this long, if I can just stick with this outside issue, then I won't drink. Right. And that changed. That big change, we talk about this threshold that some of us cross, entering into a place from which we can never go back in terms of the disease of alcoholism, right? The book talks about, peppered throughout the book in a couple of places, potential alcoholic that it was, if we'd only stopped then, maybe this wouldn't have gone so far, right? So I'd look back to those times, but there was a time that I can pinpoint really specifically that was the turning point in this. I was about 29 or 30. I was living outside of Detroit and going to college and working late and had a boyfriend and had, 2 dogs and, kind of a busy, chaotic life. And I had gotten a job at a bar to pay rent and was going to school full time. And on my way home from work one night, I had a fight with my boyfriend. I wasn't too excited about going home. And I passed a liquor store on the way home. Now I'd seen it probably 1,500 times, but for some reason I noticed it that night and the open sign was on. And I was like, okay, well, that must just be a mistake because, it's like Tuesday at like 1:00 in the morning, like liquor stores aren't open. I'm from Texas. They close at 9. They're not open on Sundays. This is ridiculous, right? It must be just an accident, but you know what? I'll just try the door. Right. And I tried the door and sure enough, they were open. Evidently liquor stores just stay open there like 24 hours. Some places I didn't know that. So I bought a bottle of vodka that night and I drank it in my driveway before going inside the house. From that night on, I stopped at that liquor store every single night and sat in my driveway before walking into my house, drinking an entire little bottle of vodka. And then it was 2 every day, right? Obviously, this led to the deterioration further of my relationship. I finished college by the skin of my teeth. I moved home to Dallas the day I graduated college. Graduated, went home, packed my U-Haul, drove back to Dallas. And by the time I got back to Dallas, full-blown alcoholism, daily drinker, morning, noon, and night. And everything since then was just kind of downhill. I'd had a series of relationships. I'd done some traveling and, still, was pretty okay. But, my health was declining. My hair was kind of, falling out. I mean, things were just like not getting any better. Outside issues stopped putting a damper on my drinking. My drinking took precedence. So that night in Detroit, I can really kind of identify as this turning point in which I never was able to go back from, right? So that's again about 29 or 30. It wasn't until I was 33 that I sought help. And I sought help because of again, another failing relationship. I'd been dating a guy. It was an international relationship. We had decided that, in order to be together, instead of doing this back and forth long distance stuff, we should probably get married. And, I could, gain entry to the country easier and, all that kind of stuff. And on his last visit to Texas, I was working at a wine bar because that's a really good job for somebody in our position. And I would just, I was drunk every day. Like I was working at a wine bar, right? Where I could drink for free all day. And yet I would stop at 7-Eleven on the way to work to buy like baby wines, and like the little box wines and like drink those on the way to work at a wine bar. Like this is where we were at that point. And, again, people around me were just like astounded at my behavior. And quite frankly, looking back on it, so am I. But at the time, all of this seemed justifiable to me. Not only justifiable, but rational. Like, I'm making a good decision. I'm gonna get that more gregarious attitude if I drink this little box of wine before work, right? I'm gonna be a better server, if I just have a little bit of a buzz going on. All of these lies that we tell ourselves. And in reality, it was probably a complete nightmare. Thank goodness I was checked out for most of it. But, that guy that I was with, he finally just said, Bridget, look, if you come home drunk from work again, I'm leaving. And like I'd said so many times to so many other people, look, okay, I hear you. You're right. I'm so sorry. Look, I just didn't have enough to eat last night. I'm so sorry. It was just a really long day. I had to do a wine tasting, all of these kinds of excuses. And the thing is, when I would say that I was sorry, I did mean it. And I was sorry. I was sorry for a lot of reasons. I was sorry because I was in a perpetual state of hungover, right? So I was sorry about that. I was sorry because I didn't remember the abusive text messages I had sent or Facebook messages I had sent the night before. I was sorry about that. I was sorry about some of the things that had come out of my mouth that I didn't really even feel, but that these awful lies that, come out when we're drinking. There's that, famous phrase, in vino veritas, right? In wine, there is truth, right? Kind of taken to mean that, when we're drinking, our real personalities come out, our real, truths and really how we feel comes out. And I have found that to be absolutely categorically false across the board. Those are not, those horrible things that I would say to people around me were not true. I don't know what it is that comes out when I put alcohol into my system, but it is dark. It is a liar and it is not me. But it's a common misconception that it's our true selves that come out. Really, it's the opposite of our true selves, right? But, to the people around me, they're thinking, oh, wow, this is really how she feels, right? When, couldn't be any further from the truth and reality. But still, I was sorry. I was real sorry. And sure enough, I came home stumbling, slurring, crying up the stairs again the next night. And he packed his bags and he left. He got on a plane. And he told me when he left, he said, if you ever want to get your stuff together, if you ever want to make a change, the door will be open. And that was it. Me thinking, okay, and I was drunk, that morning he left, I was still, okay, yeah, whatever, packing his bags. But that door being open phrase was kind of okay, I have an opportunity to make some sort of a change. But at this point, I was already feeling the pretty full force of what we go through in alcoholic torture. I was doing things like sitting in front of liquor stores, crying and not wanting to go in, stone cold sober, and going in, because I knew that that's how I was going to get through the rest of the day. This is like 10 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. You know what I mean? So I was already feeling pretty awful and out of control when it came to alcohol. I had a lot of misconceptions about what alcoholism is. I had no idea what was going on with me. It was very scary, feeling that out of control. But at the same time, I felt like I was still in some semblance of control because of things like I did still have a job. Granted, it permitted my, alcoholic behavior, right? But I did still have a job. I did still have a car. I hadn't totaled it. I did still have relationships. Granted, everyone was mad at me, 99% of the time. And I didn't understand why, but that was all their problem, right? That had nothing to do with me because I'm pretty great, right? And, that door being open line was like, okay, this is an opportunity. Maybe I can do something about the times when it feels real bad, right? And I went to work that day again at the wine bar. And I was, crying to another girl there and saying, oh God, he finally did leave, because they were all, kept abreast of my drama, obviously. And, here I am, drinking already at work again. And, she just said to me, she said, Bridget, have you ever seen me drink here? And I was like, well, no, I guess not. You're weird. You never drink with me. Right. And she was like, Bridget, I don't drink. I'm an alcoholic. And I was like, oh, right. Cool. Yeah. My dad was an alcoholic. Great. And she was like, Bridget, I think you should probably get some help. I can't afford it. I already asked a few years ago. I can't. She's like, Bridget, you just go to the Magdalen House, go to Maggie's. It's like, oh, okay. What's this? And she said, it's a social detox program. It's for alcoholic women. It's free, and it's about 400 yards from where you're standing. I was like, okay, tell me more, right? It's free. You had me at free, right? Thinking, oh God, this is probably going to be pretty awful. So I called my mom then and there, day drunk. Hey Mom, I'm going to go to this place for 2 weeks. It's free because I got to save my relationship. Thanks. Bye. Right. And, I actually called Maggie's, and I don't really 100% remember how that conversation went, but it was decided that I should probably come in that evening. And I did. And that is the beginning of my journey into recovery.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to talk about this because I think it's important. I know you talked about an outside issue, and I heard a story about you saying, I think this is what happened, but you came in saying all this says is that I need to quit drinking. It does not say anything about smoking weed. Did that come from you?
No, not that specifically, but I did come crawling up there crying, saying, if I could just smoke weed, I wouldn't drink.
Okay.
The lady that answered the door that day said, Bridget, if I could just shoot heroin, I wouldn't drink. Do the work.
So I wanted to talk to you about that because we're starting to have a conversation next up about what sobriety looks like, as far as in what we talk about of sobriety and having it for not just alcohol, but sobriety from all mind altering substances like weed, for example. Can you tell us why that's important?
Absolutely. I was a full, staunch supporter of the California sober idea, right? I never tried it. I actually quit smoking weed before I quit drinking. I was smoking weed and drinking the day I went to Maggie's. I've never smoked weed again. That was October of 2018. The reason that I never picked that back up is because I was so elated that for the first time in 2 decades, I would be able to pass a drug test, and thought I was going to need to get a different job outside of the service industry. And so when I did pick up that first drink after I got out of Maggie's, hello, 2-time Maggie's girl, I did so almost afraid to smoke weed, because I thought, I can pass a drug test, right? And I'm going to need to pass a drug test. I don't know where that thought came from, but it did. I have never smoked weed again. I've had a lot of women ask me and bring up the issue of marijuana use in meetings. And they ask questions like, well, it's legal in some states now. And, if it becomes legal here, then I don't see the problem with it. And my response is, well, okay, that's great. Alcohol's legal, so legality has nothing to do with a substance that is cutting you off from the sunlight of the spirit, right? Something that stops you, puts a block in your road from achieving what it is that you embarked on this journey for. You know, you're here because God needs something from you specifically, right? What that is, we don't know. It's not our job to know. What our job is to do the next right thing, practice these principles in all our affairs, right? You know, clean house, trust God, help others, right? Are the three kind of, you know, bullet point, you know, things that we hear over and over and over. And you can't really say that you're, you know, keeping your house clean or keeping your side of the street clean if you're still at the same time making use of things that, you know, actively turn off parts of your brain. Look, you know, I've got friends that, you know, have alcoholism that have just decided that the only reason that they can stay sober from alcohol is if they use cannabis. Now they can't find anybody to like sponsor them 99% of the time, right? And I just, you know, it saddens me to think that basically you're saying that, you know, marijuana is your higher power. Marijuana is keeping you sober from alcohol, right? Not God, right? And that to me just it doesn't encapsulate what we mean when we say recovery. Now, there are some people that, you know, also say things like cigarettes, like nicotine and caffeine are also, you know, you're not truly sober if you're smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee. I'm not quite there yet. I only started drinking coffee after I quit drinking alcohol, right? So I did quit smoking cigarettes, but I do still use a vape. So
whenever you said that, we had ladies on here just sip their coffee right there.
Yeah, I've heard that. You know, I've heard it. So I don't know. I don't know how much credence I put into it. I've never, you know, asked any authorities about it, but I've heard it. I've heard it in meetings. So,
well, I love my coffee too. Thank you so much for talking about that. So I do want. Okay, hold on. There's a question. I remember a story Bridget told me about her confidence leaving the house the first time. Yes, I wanted to talk about this. And the fear surrounding leaving the second time. Does she mind telling the group about the difference she felt both times leaving the house?
Certainly. Great question. Thank you. So, you know, you got to hear a little mini chunk of what led up to me going to Maggie's in the first place, right? I wasn't there to really, you know, find recovery. I certainly wasn't there to make friends. I was there to get enough people off of my back to give me a break, to feel sorry for me and my predicament, and therefore I can save this relationship. Right? In fact, if you, we're not at Redwood. I was going to say, if you go turn my leaf around on the wall, it says for what's his name. And in my book, this is for what's his name. That gives you an idea of the mentality that I was in the first time I was at Maggie's. Okay. This was all for a dude. Right. And what I got, you know, after 2 weeks of being there was this revolutionary education. You know, I didn't know what alcoholism was. I didn't know that I've got a body that has an abnormal reaction to alcohol, right? Which it obviously does. And I've got a mind that tells me that I don't. Shoot. I didn't know that, right? I read We Agnostics for the first time with Rosie in a meeting, and just tears, nothing. I mean, if I talk about it long enough, I will cry right now because that was a powerful meeting. You know, things were opening up in my head that had been so closed, or there wasn't even a door there, that by the time those 2 weeks were up, boy, I was on fire, right? I mean, Bill Wilson is my dad and my best friend and my mentor, right? For sure, right? Bill's my homeboy, right? He wrote my story, right? We Agnostics is giving me a way out of my terror around the word God, you know, and this body mind perplexing disease that I've got, you know, I've got a reason for why things were happening in my life around alcohol that they were, for why I was drinking like I was. I finally had, you know, an understanding of some idea of what was going on with me, right? And why. And that was really important to know. And I was so excited, y'all. Oh, I was so excited. I would walk around with my little AA book to, you know, dog parks. Have y'all seen this? You know, I mean, just like, you know, like calling my friends. Hey, did you know that I've got alcoholism and that's why I'm such a piece of trash, right? And they were like, yeah, Bridget, we know, we've met you. You know what I mean? Good for you, honey. Just, you know, whatever, keep it up. All right. You know, okay. You know, little head pat, right? I felt so good. I felt so excited to finally be able to know what was going on with me so that I could tell other people, right? Not to help them on a journey into recovery. So I could tell other people as like, here's what was going on with me. Now, A, feel sorry for me, and B, give me another chance. That was why I was so excited about everything that I had learned. It felt great, right? It was the first time in 17 years I maintained a period of sobriety, but you know, I felt great. I felt real elated. Do you want the 7-Eleven story?
I do want the 7-Eleven story.
Okay, so I get out of Maggie's for the first time on this high of excitement. And I go to the dog park every night. I still do to this day. What I used to do was either leave my dog there or take her in the car, do something and go to the 7-Eleven close to the dog park and buy my little packs of baby wines and cigarettes. And so having gotten out of Maggie's, I was going to the dog park and I was out of cigarettes. So I went up to my regular 7-Eleven and I just, you know, had this kind of moment where, you know, here I am in this environment where I've been in many, many times before. And I do the same thing every time, which is buy my little baby wines and my little cigarettes. And you know what, this time, because I've been to the Magdalen House and I read the big book and Bill Wilson's my daddy. And I am just going to skip the wine this time. And I'm just going to buy my cigarettes. And I walked past that chilled case of wine and I decided, you know what, this would be a really good opportunity for a photo shoot. So I stuck my middle finger out, took a picture of me flicking off the wine and sent it to my sponsor, thinking that was a good idea because I had licked this alcoholism business and I was super proud of myself. Right? And I bought my little cigarettes and went on my merry way. Yeah, it felt great, you know.
I have a question. What did your sponsor say in response to the picture?
I think she just laughed at it. I don't really remember. I think she just laughed at it. Yeah. Because it's super cringy. I don't know. What would you say? I don't know.
You went back a second time, and this time you did not leave with all of the cockiness and the assurance. Can you tell us about the second time you left?
Sure. So, you know, as you could probably imagine, having that sort of a really excitable, on fiery attitude in conjunction with having not gotten through the steps, not adopted real honesty, things like that. You can imagine that it was pretty quick before I took that first drink again, right? That first drink, sober, outside of having this, you know, this initial Maggie's education. Pretty depressing day, right? And again, because I wanted to pass a drug test, but I couldn't feel the way I was feeling. So that was my only alternative, right? So it was in pretty short order that I ended up having to call Maggie's again, because surprise to no one that has any understanding of this or is an alcoholic themselves, not only did I pick up right where I left off, drinking wise, it, you know, sure enough, it was absolutely increasing. We talk about the progressive nature of this disease. I can absolutely personally testify to the reality of that, right? And yeah, I mean, it was just kind of I mean, instead of blacking out and, at night, I was kind of, blacking out during the day, pretty quickly. And I was back in Maggie's in a matter of weeks. And this time, first of all, I was kind of surprised that they let me come back. And, I was pretty embarrassed to pick up the phone and say, hey, I failed. I had one of the program coordinators the day I was leaving the first time. She said, you're going to be back here. And I was pretty unhappy about that because I thought, man, I got a great attitude and I got a great attitude about all this program. And I'm really excited. And, how dare her say that to me? She doesn't know me. I'm going to show her, and sure enough, she's the one that answered the phone when I called the second time. And instead of being like, angry or anything, I couldn't have been happier that she's the one that picked up the phone, and they let me come back. They let me come back on Christmas Eve. That was pretty, you can imagine that being a pretty devastating reality to face, that, feeling really good about this has me so beat. I have to drag myself back in here. Some of these sketchy women on Christmas Eve, that was a pretty rough blow. I tried to keep my head down a little bit more the second time. And by the time I left, I felt good again because I'd had a 2-week kind of a dry out period, I guess. But pretty depressed, thinking, hey, I've done this before. And it didn't work. Right? I've stayed the whole 2 weeks. I got a sponsor. I've read the book and this hasn't worked. I don't know why this is going to work again, but they're telling me that I should probably just stay. Right?
Are you or someone you love struggling with the inability to stop drinking? At the Magdalen House, we believe that alcoholism education and recovery is crucial to helping more alcoholic women and their families recover. Our staff is available to provide speakers to the public who will discuss the disease of alcoholism, how to help someone who may be struggling, and more available resources. To request a speaker, please visit our website, magdalenhouse.org/education.
So it was with that kind of a little bit more, despondent attitude in which I left the house the second time. I was advised that it would be a good idea for me to go into sober living. There was a big personal issue surrounding my dog with that, whether or not, my mother told me, I live with my mom, if you guys haven't figured that out, told me that she wasn't going to keep my dog if I went into sober living. Everybody was so pissed at me, and she was like, you're just going to have to give her up for adoption and, go into sober living. And I was really torn with that decision. I ended up deciding that, looking back on how I was taking care of my dog, she would be better off with someone else. You guys, when I was drinking, she wouldn't be in the same room with me. I never hit her, but I did things like leave her at the dog park. I mean, I was doing things like leaving her locked in my car overnight because I was passed out in the front yard. I hadn't even made it to my back door, right? Those are the kinds of things that was going on with me at the end of the drinking, right? And so thinking, how selfish it was of me to insist that I keep her and, and I treat her this way. And guys, I'm like obsessed with my dog. Don't be calling animal control. Like it's not, you know what I mean? Some people get really upset when I tell them stuff like that, but this is the ugly truth of what this looks like for a lot of people, and if we don't tell the truth about this kind of stuff, right? Other people keep their dirty stuff in the dark. I don't like telling those stories, you guys. I'm embarrassed. I'm horrified. I'm like obsessed with this dog. And yet I did things like that. Okay. So that's why I tell you guys that. So, so I made that decision. Okay, you know what? I'm willing to try something really different here this time. And so I went, I got out of Maggie's. I went and I interviewed at a sober living house and I picked one close to my house. And they rejected me. And I still to this day don't know why, because I was like, okay, I'm really trying something new. I'm willing to give up this thing that I love in order to do this, because this is what I'm being advised from the people around me and have seen, this fail, right? Something's got to change, right? Something's got to give. And I'm trying to do the things, I'm trying to do the change, right? And I've been rejected. So, I mean, I'm sure you can guess what happened. Spoiler alert, I did not stay sober the second time I got out of Maggie's. And, that might come as a shock because of how different my attitude was, but it shouldn't be a shock at all, because the reality is I wasn't through the work. I hadn't worked the 12 steps. I'd stopped on step 3. Why would it be a surprise to anyone that I picked up a drink? I hadn't had any sort of a spiritual awakening. I was hung up. So, do you have any questions there, or just keep going? Or?
I'd like for you to talk about, because you just mentioned step 3. Can you talk about that? Your hang up on step 3 and that being kind of a game changer for you this time around?
Yes, certainly. I mean, it was a game changer both times, because step 3 was my pause point, right? I'd come into this, I'd been to AA meetings before I went to Maggie's. My mother was driving me to AA meetings at Lake Highlands. And the very first time I walked in, I was drunk, and Big Steve shook my hand, and, there were 12 steps on the wall. And I looked at those 12 steps, having never seen them before, and saw God all over the place. And I was like, okay, great, right. I'm in the wrong building, right? Like, I'm in the wrong room. Like, this is so cute and so great that works for you people. But this is not for me, because I don't believe in God. And I'm glad that you guys have found something, but this evidently is not going to be for me, right? And so, of course, having done things like gone through, 2 weeks at Maggie's, having done things like, read We Agnostics, read the entire book, and had this. There's a line on page 11 that I love so much, and it says, something was at work in the human heart, which has done the impossible. And I swear by that line, because even though I wasn't able to grasp on to the God notion with both hands yet, something was working in me. Something that I had picked up, something that had been imparted to me there, stuck, and was working in this human heart, right? And it was doing the impossible, right? But I wasn't there yet. I was still too much living in here, in my mind, which we obviously know is flawed and a totally alcoholic brain, right? So, and very closed. And so, step 3, turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand him. I could look past the as we understand him being underlined, but how am I going to turn my will and my life over to the care of something that I don't fully believe in, right? I needed God to be something that I could visualize. I needed God to be something that I could articulate. I needed God to be something that I could explain to someone else, because if I could explain it to someone else, I could explain it to myself. And if I couldn't explain it to myself, therefore it wasn't. And we're just going to have to leave that somewhere else, because if I can't do those things, then it's not really there and I can't accept it. And if I can't accept it, how am I expected to turn my will and my life over to the care of this? Well, I'm not going to. I run my life. I run my will. I'm doing an okay job. Right. Absolutely refused to move on from step 3. And I'd had conversations with my sponsor about this God dilemma many times. I don't think she had the same problem that I did with walking into Maggie's or any kind of a 12-step program without God. I think that she had already walked in here believing in God, whatever that is to her, right? And I was pretty annoying, surprise to no one. I was pretty annoying about this notion and, just couldn't get over it. And well, I don't know, I just can't do it. I just, and she was just like, she finally just stopped me one day and she said, God, Bridget, did you make the sunrise this morning? And of course, I've told Stephanie this because this is how annoying I am, you guys. I was just like, well, the sun really actually didn't rise this morning. The earth was just like turning on its axis and blah, blah, blah. And she was just like, Bridget, stop. She was like, did you make the earth turn on its axis this morning? And I said, no. And she said, Bridget, that's a power greater than yourself. You need to move on. And for some reason that clicked, like, okay, if I can just let go of needing to have God figured out, maybe I can move forward from here, right? Maybe I can just move forward from here. Sure enough, and it's fascinating too, because what I've learned since then and what I've learned through personal experience, you guys, if you come into a program without having this strong relationship with God, like I just described was my experience with you guys, it's fascinating that it's not, you don't have to, right? You don't have to come in here with that. If that, is such a hang up for you, like it was for me, there are some things that really helped me get over that hump. And it wasn't just that one line from my sponsor. I mean, step 2 says came to believe, right? Not walk in here with an understanding, not walk in here. We don't embark on this journey with an intimate knowledge of God or a close relationship with a God of our understanding. That's not what happens for a lot of us. Heck, most of us, right? We came to believe, right? That a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, right? We get that, right? And when we look all the way down, skip some steps, look all the way down to, don't skip any steps. I'm saying if you skip down while you're reading the steps and look at what step 12 says, what does step 12 say? Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps is the first part of that 3-part step, right? We tried to carry this message to other alcoholics and practice these principles in all our affairs. But that first line in step 12 explains to newcomers what it is that we get from embarking on a 12-step program. We do not graduate alcoholism. We have a spiritual awakening. So if you're stuck on like a step 3, like I was, right, where you can't grasp this God stuff, hello, do the rest of the work. Keep going. If you didn't make the sunrise this morning, that's a power greater than yourself. Keep going. Because if you do these steps honestly and thoroughly with your sponsor as directed out of the book, you will have unequivocally, absolutely will have a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. Sorry, Stephanie. Were you trying to say something?
No, it's okay. I love your passion. It's wonderful. I'm going to start saying, though, if instead of did you make the sunrise, I'm going to start saying, did you make the earth turn on its axle? Because I think that's more correct. Yeah.
Sure.
So I know that we have listeners on here or who are going to listen to are wondering what happened with the guy that, you wrote on the leaf and in the book and all that. What happened with that?
Great question. So, I, again, embarked on this, so excited to salvage this relationship, right? Doing anything it took, right? Go to any length, right? And, when I finally had access to my phone again, after getting out of Maggie's, I couldn't wait to tell him everything that I had now learned. Like, hey, look, this really wasn't my fault. I'm not just a bad person that continually makes bad decisions. There's a disease called alcoholism. I've got it. right? And here's what this looks like. And here's why I've been just, acting in this absolutely atrocious and baffling way for the last number of years. I'm sorry, right? And when I finally did get a hold of him, he said, Bridget, I'm glad how passionate you are, right? But it really wasn't your drinking. I just didn't want to be with you. So we've actually never spoken again. He has no idea that I'm, active recovered, right? He has absolutely no idea about that. And, I was so desperate when making my, my 8th step. I was so desperate to make amends to him. And I was so disappointed when my sponsor said that this is a never amends, and that this is not someone that I'm going to make amends to, because this is someone who does not want to talk to me like ever again. And, I'm so glad she was so correct in doing so, because, why do you think that I was so desperate to make amends to him? Do you think that I was desperate to make amends to him because I was genuinely sorry for the things that I had put him through? Or do you think it's because I desperately wanted to show him how well I was doing? Spoiler alert, it's definitely the latter. I wanted to make amends so bad because I wanted to show him that I was just great now and like totally, totally fine. And he's made a mistake and he should have stuck by me through this journey. That was my intent. That was my motivation for that. And my sponsor saw, right through me, right? And put that on a never. And still to this day, years on, we've never spoken again. I have no idea how he is or what he's doing. And that's okay. That's okay. And, if you had told me that would be okay, I can't tell you what I would have done. We think that when we, get sober, when we begin to work a program, when we begin to have these revelations in our lives, and I mean revelations, right? Revolutionary changes in our minds, in our hearts, in our souls, in our bodies, right? When we have these big changes, that everything is going to just fall back into place the way we want it to and the way we think that it should, what's going to make us happy. And that doesn't always happen, right? And you hear so many things do. Okay, guys, so many things do fall into place exactly how they should be. It just might not be the way that we have, in our little machinations, our little plans, right? The way that we want them to be, our ideal vision of what, happy, recovered life is going to look like, And, I would listen to women come in and, they'd come tell their stories about, their lives had fallen apart and their relationships had fallen apart and they got sober and their relationship was healed. He tore up the divorce papers. He gave me back on my engagement ring, all this kind of stuff. And I just wasn't, having that experience. It wasn't everything came flooding back into place. It was everything stayed far and broken, right? Just because everything stayed far and broken didn't mean that I couldn't heal, that I couldn't recover, right? And I needed to hear that, when I was, really beginning to work this, because I wasn't hearing it. I was hearing, all the happy, la, everything was families reunited, blah, blah, blah. It didn't always happen. It doesn't always happen, but just because it doesn't happen doesn't mean that you can't recover, right? Because you can. I'm living testament to the reality of that, So, okay.
No, I think it's really great to hit on, because it just, while you were talking, I kept thinking of like, we can get well regardless of anyone. The only condition necessary is that we clean house and trust God, so.
Absolutely.
And what's so crazy too is like internally, like I can feel okay no matter what my external circumstances are, which is, so if anybody is, going through something like that, like you can feel okay and you can be okay. We are getting to the top of the hour. So thank you, Bridget. You're so fun. Does anybody have any final questions before I ask the wrap-up question? Okay. If you could leave us with one takeaway, the listeners or the people on here, what would that one takeaway that you'd want to leave us with?
Let go. Just let go. I mean, everything that you're holding on to reservation wise about working an honest program, everything that you're holding on to that you're afraid of not coming back, everything, like when you have that real step one experience, which to me looks like having that deep internal realization that yes, I am powerless over alcohol and my life has become unmanageable. That's really what step one is for me, is that absolute certainty in yourself that that's a reality for you. That is a scary, scary, scary realization. And the scarier it is, perhaps the better, because it should light a fire under you to get to work, right? Because we can be relieved of this, right? But it's scary because it means things are going to change. And people are afraid of change. It's natural. And if you can let go of the reservations holding you back and see what befalls you on your road when you embark on this journey, things that you absolutely cannot imagine, those are the things worth sticking with it. I don't know. I'm not wrapping this up particularly articulately or anything really outstanding. But I think, I don't know, if I had known what my life could be like the first, or heck, even the second time I went to Maggie's, if I could have known what my life could be like now, I would have run at this with both arms open so friggin' fast, y'all. You know, so fast, absolutely no hesitations. Now, what is God? You know, that kind of stuff that hung me up for months and kept me drunk for months, right? That right there kept me drunk for months. And it's just, you know, I mean, looking back on it, it seems silly. It was important at the time, you know, but it seems silly. But, you know, if I could have known, if I could have heard someone say, just, honey, put it down, let it go, you know, and just move on and just see what happens. Oh boy, full tilt, arms open. Yeah. I don't know. I guess.
I think that leaves a lot of hope, because for sure, if I could have known what my life could be like in recovery, I probably would have gotten sober before.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And I think that's wonderful. So thank you so much, Bridget. Thank you everyone for tuning on to hear Bridget this morning. And I will see you guys later. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
We hope you've enjoyed this From the Vault re-release of the Magdalen House podcast. Tune in every first and third Wednesday for a new release from one of our 3 podcast series. To learn more about the Magdalen House and the services we offer, visit magdalenhouse.org or follow us on your favorite social media channels by searching for the Magdalen House.